Ravenswood Forest had always been a place of local legend. Nestled on the edge of our sleepy town, its stories were passed around like a rite of passage. Stories of strange disappearances, eerie sightings, and the old hermit who supposedly lived there decades ago. The forest had a reputation that kept most people at bay, but for some reason, it always intrigued me. Last year, after a rough breakup and a series of stressful weeks at work, I decided I needed to get away. My idea of escape? Spending a weekend alone in Ravenswood. I had heard the warnings, but solitude and nature seemed like exactly what I needed to clear my head. I packed light. Just a tent, some food, a flashlight, and my journal. The plan was simple. Hike in during the day, set up camp in the heart of the forest, and spend 2 nights under the stars. The first few hours of the hike were uneventful. The sunlight filtered through the tall, ancient trees, and the sounds of birds and rustling leaves provided a kind of soothing background music. But as I ventured deeper, the forest changed. The air grew colder, and the light struggled to pierce the thick canopy above. Even the sounds of wildlife seemed to dwindle. I found a small clearing, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. Setting up my tent, I tried to shake off the growing sense of unease. The stories were just stories, I told myself. Still, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every so often, convinced I wasn't as alone as I thought. That night, as I sat by my campfire, the forest felt unnaturally quiet. No crickets, no owls, not even the whisper of wind through the trees. Just an oppressive silence that seemed to close in around me. I tried to distract myself by writing in my journal, but the words came slowly, my thoughts clouded by unease. Then I heard it, a faint rustling just beyond the circle of firelight. I froze, my pen hovering over the page. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small and uncertain. The rustling stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, deliberately, a whisper broke through the stillness. "Leave." The voice was soft, almost lost in the crackle of the fire, but it was unmistakable. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The beam landed on trees, shadows, and nothing more. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the wind, or my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. The whispers returned that night, keeping me awake in my tent. Sometimes they seemed close, as if someone was crouched right outside the fabric. Other times, they seemed to come from far away, carried on an unfelt breeze. By morning, I was exhausted but determined to stick it out. I told myself I'd come here for solitude and reflection, and I wasn't about to let a few creepy noises scare me off. The second day, I ventured deeper into the forest, hoping the hike would clear my mind. As I walked, I began to notice strange markings on the trees, symbols carved into the bark, their meaning unknown to me. Some looked like spirals, others like jagged stars or crude faces. They grew more frequent the farther I went. Then I stumbled upon something that made my stomach drop. In a small grove, arranged in a perfect circle, were piles of rocks. Each pile was topped with an object: a broken doll, a rusted knife, a stuffed animal so decayed it was barely recognizable. They looked like offerings. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest around me felt different now, heavier, as if the very air was pressing down on me. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "Get out! You shouldn't be here." I tried to ignore them, but sleep was impossible. At one point, I swore I heard footsteps circling my tent, slow and deliberate. I gripped the handle of my knife, my knuckles white, and waited for dawn. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, I packed up my camp as quickly as I could. I didn't care about finishing the weekend anymore. I just wanted to leave. But the forest had other plans. As I retraced my steps, the landscape seemed to shift. Trails that had been clear the day before now seemed unfamiliar, overgrown and tangled with roots. The symbols on the trees were everywhere, their crude shapes mocking me. And then I saw them. Figures, just at the edge of my vision. Tall, thin, and impossibly still, their faces obscured by shadows. Every time I turned to look directly at them, they were gone, but I could feel their presence, watching. Panic set in as I realized I was hopelessly lost. My map was useless, and the sun seemed to move too quickly, dragging the forest into premature darkness. By the time night fell, I was stumbling blindly, my flashlight flickering as its batteries drained. I came across a small cabin, its roof sagging and windows shattered. Desperate, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was sparse, just a table, a chair, and a fireplace filled with ash. But on the walls, carved deep into the wood, were the same symbols I'd seen on the trees. The whispers were deafening now, overlapping and chaotic. "You can't leave. Join us. Stay forever." I backed into a corner, clutching my knife, as the door creaked open. The figures stepped inside, their movements jerky and unnatural, like puppets on invisible strings. Their faces were featureless, smooth and pale like polished stone. As they closed in, I screamed, slashing wildly with my knife. The blade passed through them as if they were made of smoke, and their whispers filled my head, drowning out my thoughts. The last thing I remember is falling to the floor, my vision fading as their cold, empty faces loomed over me. When I woke, I was lying on the edge of the forest, my gear scattered around me. My clothes were torn, and my arms were covered in scratches, but I was alive. I don't know how I escaped Ravenswood, but I haven't gone back. The whispers still haunt my dreams, and sometimes, when I'm alone, I feel those unseen eyes watching me. The forest didn't let me go. It just let me leave, for now. I never wanted to move to Cedar Hollow. The town was too quiet, too isolated, and surrounded by miles of dense forest that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. My dad's new job at the local mill had brought us here, and while he and Mum settled in with enthusiasm, I struggled to adjust. It wasn't just the small town vibe or the way the locals seemed wary of newcomers. It was the woods. Cedar Hollow was famous for its hiking trails, but there were constant warnings about sticking to the marked paths. People talked in hushed tones about the lost path, a trail that didn't appear on any map, but had a reputation for luring hikers to their doom. I brushed it off as local folklore. Every town had its spooky stories. But when you're 17, bored, and looking for a distraction from a life you didn't choose, curiosity gets the better of you. On a crisp autumn afternoon, I decided to explore the trails on my own. The trees were ablaze with red and orange leaves, and the air carried the faint smell of pine and damp earth. With my backpack loaded with water, snacks, and my phone, I set off down one of the marked trails. At first, it was peaceful. The sunlight filtered through the branches, and the sounds of birds and rustling leaves filled the air. But after about an hour, I noticed something strange. The trail seemed to be narrowing. The dirt path, well trodden and wide at the start, had become uneven and overgrown. I stopped, pulling out the trail map I'd grabbed from the visitor center. According to the map, I was still on the main loop, but nothing around me looked familiar. The trees here were older, their branches twisted and gnarled like the fingers of an ancient giant. Then I saw it, a wooden signpost, weathered and splintered, leaning at an odd angle. The words carved into it were barely legible, but I could make out 2 words: Lost Path. I laughed nervously, telling myself it was just a prank or some old marker left by campers. But a part of me was intrigued. I'd heard the warnings, but what if there was something to discover? Maybe it was just an overgrown shortcut, forgotten over time. Against my better judgment, I stepped off the main trail. The lost path was different from the others. The air felt heavier, the light dimmer, even though it was only mid-afternoon. The trees grew closer together, their roots sprawling across the ground like traps waiting to trip me. As I walked, I realized the bird song had stopped. The forest was unnervingly quiet, save for the crunch of leaves under my boots. I kept going, convincing myself that the path would loop back around to the main trail eventually. Then the smell hit me, something foul and rotten, like meat left out in the sun for too long. It was so strong I gagged, covering my nose with my sleeve. I scanned the woods, expecting to see a dead animal or something, but there was nothing. Nothing except for the silence. The path ahead curved sharply, and as I rounded the bend, I froze. In the middle of the trail stood a tree unlike any I'd seen before. It was massive, its trunk blackened and charred as though it had been struck by lightning. But it wasn't burned. It was alive. Its branches reached out in all directions, and carved into the bark were symbols I didn't recognize. And then I saw them. Figures, faint and ghostly, moving among the trees. At first, I thought they were shadows, cast by the shifting sunlight, but they moved against the light, darting between the trunks. My heart pounded as I realized they were watching me. "Turn back," a voice whispered, so soft I thought I imagined it. I spun around, expecting to see someone, but the trail behind me was empty. The figures grew bolder, stepping closer. They were translucent, their features blurred, as though I was looking at them through rippled glass. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a root, and fell hard onto the ground. "Turn back," the voice repeated, louder this time. Scrambling to my feet, I bolted. The path seemed to shift beneath me, twisting and turning in directions I hadn't seen before. The trees blurred as I ran, their branches clawing at my clothes and skin. I stopped when I saw something ahead, a clearing. Relief washed over me as I stumbled into the open space, only to freeze in horror. In the center of the clearing stood a cabin, its wooden walls warped and covered in moss. The windows were shattered, and the door hung slightly ajar. Despite its abandoned appearance, smoke curled lazily from the chimney. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the forest itself was pulling me toward the cabin. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "Go inside. Find the truth." Before I knew it, I was standing on the porch, my hand reaching for the doorknob. The wood was cold, and as I pushed the door open, the smell of decay hit me like a wave. The interior was dim, lit only by the weak light filtering through the broken windows. The walls were covered in more of those strange symbols, carved deep into the wood. In the center of the room was a table, and on it lay an open journal. I approached cautiously, my breath hitching as I flipped through the pages. The writing was frantic, the ink smudged as though the writer's hand had been trembling. "They don't let you leave," one entry read. "The forest is alive," said another. "The path is a trap. Don't follow the whispers." A chill ran down my spine as I read the final entry. If you're reading this, it's already too late. The door slammed shut behind me. The whispers became a roar, overlapping voices filling the cabin with an unbearable cacophony. The walls seemed to close in, the symbols glowing faintly as if they were alive. I ran to the door, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The figures appeared outside the windows, their ghostly faces pressed against the glass, watching. "Stay with us! You can't leave." The last thing I remember is the floor giving way beneath me, and a darkness so complete it felt alive, swallowing me whole. When I woke up, I was lying on the forest floor, the morning sun breaking through the trees. My backpack was gone, my phone shattered, and my arms were covered in scratches. I staggered back to town, half mad with fear. No one believed me when I told them what happened. They just shook their heads, saying I'd let the legends get to me. But I know the truth. The lost path isn't a story. It's a trap, and the forest doesn't let everyone go. Sometimes, at night, I hear the whispers again, faint and distant, calling me back. And I know if I ever return, I won't escape a second time.